Hey guys, this is part 2 of my interview with Timon Cline. This is a little bit different than I normally release episodes, but Timon and I had such a great time talking that I wanted to break this up into 2 different episodes. And so if you're looking for episode 1, if you missed episode 1, you can look in the show notes and you can make sure and go listen to the first half of our interview, episode 1 of our interview. I also wanted to remind you, if you are a big fan of the show, make sure you subscribe. Click that subscribe icon and share this episode with your friends. Share the podcast with your friends. Leave us a great rating. And then another way you can help out the podcast effort is hop onto Patreon. There will be a link to that in the show notes as well. And you can sign up to be a subscriber, where I ask exclusive questions and hear from you guys and you who are a big fan of the show more directly. So I'd love it if you could hop on there and subscribe any amount on Patreon. That goes a long way to helping put on the show. So with that said, here's my second half of my interview with Timon Cline. A lot of my friends, they hear me kind of joke about, yeah, we're Christian nationalists, whatever. And they think I'm downplaying what I grew up in, which is basically I grew up in a Southern Baptist church culture. Yeah. Where as a child, it's very like overlap church and state. You've got 4th of July ceremonies where we're not singing hymns. We're singing songs about America. You've got fireworks. You've got politicians speaking. The best example I can think of is Robert Jeffries in Dallas, which was in my orbit growing up. And so they think that I'm saying like, that's who I am. And I'm like, that's not what I'm talking about. What are we talking about when we say Christian nationalism? When you say, whether you joke about it or embrace the term, whatever it is, like, how do you help those people come along and really see like, that's not a proper manifestation of what I'm talking about here. Yeah.
I mean, the easiest answer, most simple one is just like, they're just goofy. Like, look at those people. This is not Jeffress or doing this "Make America Great Again" hymn, right? This kind of thing. This would not at all be what I would identify with. And I grew up in the SBC as well with similar experiences, and of course, certainly in like your adolescence and teenage years, look down on that because it's cool too, right? Right. And this you're supposed to think that that's embarrassing. Yep. I would say, it may be a impractical and sloppy expression of these impulses, but that are nevertheless good and natural impulses. And they need to be channeled better. And this is part of the intellectual project. So maybe you would say they're necessary but insufficient, or they're acceptable but not fully formed. And I think what I've come to realize is this is again, these impulses are very natural. The separation of church and state, as liberalism tries to frame it, is not either sustainable or historically attested to as Christians in our history and tradition. I mean, this whether you want to begin with Constantine or with the magisterial reformers, you'll find nothing that helps you there until maybe the bloody tenet from Roger Williams. So the distinction is not to be so stark, and this is a fiction of liberalism that's been imposed upon us. Not only is it not desirable, but it's impossible, actually, because it was, I think you've talked about before, wherever, either Twitter or on your podcast. I mean, there's many things that fill the gap for religion, for proper religion or true religion when it's not filling the gap. There's some moral basis that's always forming the impetus or rationale for laws and these things. So when you look at a country or a people, they naturally have some kind of religious character. This is just a fact, because we're religious people. Our theology tells us this. The Calvin tells us this. And so it's of course very natural to think then that this should be instructive to and influential upon your life together, your symbiotics. As Althusius would put it, your living together, which is political life. That's all it is. Not defining politics narrowly as kind of partisanship is really not helpful. We're all annoyed with talking about like the tax code or something, but what we're really getting at is, what does community look like? And that's politics. And so it's only natural, of course, that your religion should influence it, and that you should seek to have religious agreement. If man is a religious being as well as a social being, that means the two have to coincide.
Yep.
And so maybe it's sloppily and kind of corny in its expression that we see from MAGA country or whatever. But I kind of despise the people that look down on those people now that are just following a ill-formed impulse, and maybe wreaking some havoc along the way. But the people who have the ability to help them formulate a better articulation of that just make fun of them instead.
Right.
And those are the people from where we've grown up, as we were talking about before the show started.
Right.
And I've come to think, actually, those people have not. You have to learn to ignore this impulse and learn to ignore this reality of society. They've not learned it yet, and the people that I used to, affiliate with when I was younger have learned to, and that is then presented as virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's kind of gross now. And you have lots of parties in our own, big Eva world, TGC or whatever, that proliferate that.
Yeah.
And I think it's incredibly unpastoral and also unrealistic and ahistorical.
Yeah, I agree. And it's really fascinating when I have my, I keep encountering pastors and they'll tell me about, I have this family in my church and they're super MAGA, super Trumpers, whatever. And I'm like, can I talk to them? Like, cause they don't, I mean, for better or for worse, that's not my context. I don't have those kind of conversations very often at my church. Maybe I'm not based enough or Christian nationalist or whatever, but I think
it's just that you're in Boulder.
I think so too. And so I always want to talk to them because I'm not so certain that kind of sneering at them and despising them is going to be the most helpful thing. In fact, I really do believe that if I just could get on the phone with them, I could kind of show them a better way, because I do still view a lot of their expressions and whatever it is kind of adding to the noise. But like you said, their impulse to want to belong to a people, to defend what they have, to kind of stand up for certain values. These are all good things. And this higher education kind of globalist approach to Christianity, even, where we downplay the local, we downplay the nation, we downplay society in favor of kind of like one of my stories that really confounds me, and it truly does, is and it's one of the most famous stories of Jesus, where he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And the moral we've taken in the modern age is everyone is my neighbor. So what it does, though, is we so abstractize it. We take it out of the text and we say, therefore, every human, all 7 billion of us on the planet, they're my neighbor, which in some ways, wherever you go, yes, those are now your neighbors, but it depersonalizes it.
Yeah.
And so it's the same way as saying, well, I love everyone. And I don't have some kind of special love for my wife. Like I privilege the love for my wife over you or over my neighbor. And that's a godly thing. That's what is C.S. Lewis or somebody else? It's an order of love issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's also taking away, kind of the Burkean conception of good, this word is just associated with racism now, but good discrimination of we can make, as a society, as a community, this, not that. Not everything has to be completely follow to its logical conclusions or have exact parity. You can say, we want to do this, not that. I mean, going back to New England, one of my favorite quotes from Nathaniel Ward is to say, these people, meaning that a lot of the dissenters, have all the religious liberty in the world to go elsewhere. Meaning, we're doing this here. You can join in. You're welcome. If not, there's plenty of territory. Go elsewhere.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is somewhat of the, especially of like the boomers that we make fun of now. I mean, I like to say the new right is more boomer than the boomers. That's what we're doing. But the boomers, I mean, think about what they've lost. If you're born in like the 40s and 50s and now you're getting into old age, I mean, the change is incredible. The only, culturally, I don't know if the change can be rivaled by a prior generation. Materially, the generation prior to them probably experienced more material change, just moving from like outhouses to nuclear war in your lifetime. That's nuts. But in America, the boomers have experienced a certain loss, and it's kind of made fun of now or poked at, that like you want this 1950s ideal that never existed, and some of that may be true. But the picture that our friend Clifford Humphrey will always point to is the difference between New York City in the whenever it is the 40s or 50s on Easter, having all the skyscrapers have crosses,
right,
as opposed to a couple years ago when they're doing the rainbow flag stuff, right?
Yes.
That's it. That's what people. Some of this comes up in the Tim Keller dust up over the past week. I mean, this is what people are missing, and so that's where I've actually developed a lot of compassion for our parents' generation. Really. They're not very good at articulating it. They're very angry. This comes out in really nasty ways sometimes, really counterproductive ways. But I get it. And I think not just putting them down, is a good virtue to develop, but then also move forward and say, well, what is it about this that's really bothering them? Maybe it's something very natural. They just can't articulate it because they never were forced to.
Right.
And also looking at, moving from a sort of David Barton levels style of like American history of the founding, which is, very poorly sourced and kind of a joke, to something more serious that is also still pushing back against a progressive narrative. And there was one. I mean, this is the effect of narratives is incredible, and they're effective in very short order.
Yes.
It's really like 50 years that a particular narrative of America has been formulated, distilled, and dictates both policy and the popular consciousness, the popular imagination. So this is important work to do. And part of, small thing I'm trying to do is just draw out a lot of sources. And say there's documentary history here. There's actually some really good social history from a couple decades ago about communal life in New England, these sorts of things that counteract a lot of the general narratives even evangelicals carry with them now.
Right.
And is producing things like what Russell Moore does, what Paul Miller does, what David French does. They're all operating with this narrative that's simply not founded in the historical artifacts. It just doesn't exist.
That's what I love about the article. I mean, honestly, to be frank, like I read the top part and then I saw you were citing all these sources, and I'm like, this is going to be legit. And so I started scrolling because I was like, what's he going to get to? Because at this point, the evidence is just overwhelming. If you just look at the documents, if you just look at the history, to dispute the fact that it was a Christian culture, which is a good thing and we should want, which I know some of my friends will not like. We should want a Christian culture. We should want Christianity to flourish. We should want more Christians to be made. And then you look at the founding documents, there's no doubt that Christianity was the norm of the way that people reasoned and thought about society. And we shouldn't apologize for that. And I think that's what frustrates me, is like somehow we should feel sorry for saying that. Now, I get the whole argument. There was corruption in there. There were all sorts of things we may not do if we were in their shoes, particularly regarding slavery and race. But that's part of the reason I'm doing my PhD, is because I really want to look at how they conceived of that in that time, not to try to justify it, but to try to understand, like, what was their conception of the Imago Dei? What was their conception of, because John Eliot's out there on the frontier, and he's translating. I mean, this is the first time in 1,000 years that the Bible is being translated into a native language.
Was he doing Algonquin? What was he doing?
I think that's right. And he's out there doing it. And you don't do that. You don't educate people who you view as less than human. And so even this last week, and I mentioned this in my sermon on Sunday, I don't know how it was received very well, but I think it was the point that Harvard just released a study where between 1636, when Harvard was founded, and 1783, when slavery was outlawed in Massachusetts, over those about 150 years, staff members associated or faculty associated with Harvard had owned around 70 slaves total over 150 years. And so in order to remedy that past thing that was 250 years ago, they're now allocating $100 million to something. We don't know what, to try to remedy their guilt over these past sins. And the point of bringing that up wasn't to diminish, the conversation on slavery and the brutality that happened alongside slavery, but it is to talk about how the secular mind has no concept of how to deal with the guilt or deal with the shame or deal with the fear, all this kind of stuff, and how the more we diminish our Christian heritage, the worse it's going to get.
Yeah, they make it causal, right? Which is ridiculous to say just because there's evident failings. I mean, I'd point out two things. The first one's short, which is I'm going to forget which church it is in Massachusetts. I have this written down somewhere, but there's a particular church. I want to say it's Richard Mather's congregation, but I could be wrong, where they welcome into their church as a member a woman who's a slave. And she's very well known for her how effective she is at evangelizing some of the native populations. And she is going to be at one point sold from her current master, who's like a merchant in Massachusetts, in Boston, who's not a member of the church. She's going to be sold elsewhere. The church rallies together and buys her freedom because she's their sister. I mean, this is just, I'm not, this doesn't kind of smooth over everything, but it's like that is a hitch in the giddy up.
That's right.
On the narrative, right? There's the human. We would say the same thing about abortion over the past 50 years. The activity is really complicated. How you start parsing that has to be careful. I'm not sure you can actually do it if you weren't there. It's just very complicated. But even Cheryl Harris, famous article on whiteness as property. That article, if you haven't read it, you should. Her first 10 to 15 pages on the historical narrative of how the distinction between, or I guess you would say, slavery predicated upon race develops is way into the 18th century. I actually think her history is very good because she's relying on non-critical theorists to do it.
Okay.
And it says in the 17th century, the Puritan period, the indentured white servant and the enslaved black person, there's really class-wise, there's no distinction. There's just it's not a racial thing yet. Race is not actually developed as a category till later. It's very good. I mean, so the point is, this is a complicated history, and the packaging of it to be an activist type of history is doing us all a disservice.
Right.
But the latter thing I would say is, the real slavery as a scourge kind of on the nation does have real effect. And part of my narrative that I haven't fully written anywhere is that, as we've talked about, the states at the founding are the moral centers. This is where, even today in our constitutional doctrine, we recognize the state police power, which is the state's inherent power to regulate from morals, health, safety, all these things. This came up in our COVID-19 conversation.
Mm-hmm.
At the state level, this is where it was always lodged because it's inherited from the colonial charters and really the royal power, and it just carries on. So this is part of why you need them to assent to the Constitution and these things, the national government. So this is where the moral authority is why you have establishments, all these things. Part of my kind of thesis in general about American history is that because slavery was not dealt with at the founding as it should have been. Maybe it was politically impossible, but we would say morally it should have been.
Sure.
By the time you get to the Civil War, it is so decimated, the moral credibility and authority of the states, that a national action that Lincoln takes, and I think Noah Friedman or Feldman at Harvard has written a new book called I can't remember what it is. It's all about Lincoln. He essentially accepts the Southern kind of lost cause theory of Lincoln being a dictator and says, yeah, that's true.
Oh, wow.
He just totally, Noah Feldman's a Harvard law professor. So he was like, that's true. He overrides everything. It's a new founding. He just decimates it.
Wow.
So it's a very clever kind of thesis.
Yeah.
And of course he says it's for the good. And I would agree with him. I would say at that point, 1850s, you've got to do something.
Okay.
And this is what it takes. But what that does, unfortunately, to our system, our polity, is it begins to, at that point, erode the moral authority and credibility at the state level, which was always within a federalist system supposed to be the epicenter of religious and moral life. And so by the time you get to the 1940s, you can officially incorporate the Establishment Clause into the states, where you could never have a state church again.
Huh.
Right. So 1947 is when that happens with the Everson case. That's how long it takes. Like,
right.
Until then, you could have done it. So it's like that's just a contingency of history. It was the right thing to do it, like, each moment. But it's very sad, because it's like we gave up our birthright in a certain sense early on, and you never are able to recover. So the tentative the title for that thesis out there is like dead on arrival. Like, it just is never going to work because you didn't deal with this. If you had, the nation would be very different. And that is why you don't have a thoroughly Christian nation now, because the funneling up is gone.
Fascinating.
That's what's happened. So that both acknowledges the extreme kind of the problem we had with slavery, the extreme grave sin, the necessity of dealing with it, but also a Christian nationalist strand of this is what it should have been. So both of those things put together might confound certain narratives of what a conservative Christian is supposed to think about these things. And I just see them now as a lamentable inevitability.
Yeah.
That's how it goes. But it doesn't take away from the fact of what the founding looked like in terms of Christianity that I talk about in the article. And therefore, it's still having some import for us today on where we should be directing our national affections and energies in that sense. So
that's great.
I hope that was somewhat cogent, but what you said sparked that idea.
No, that's great. I love it. New ideas, and it helped me kind of think more deeply and differently about a lot of those different topics, especially someone originally from Texas, have a lot of state pride. And I think of Lee, who had a lot of state pride in Virginia. And so, I think it broadens the conversation. And I do like poking holes in kind of the myths, especially the myths that don't comport with history itself, with the stuff you laid out in your article. I think kind of one last thing would be at the end of your article, you mention, I'll just read the last paragraph. The sects and factions that dominated the socio-political life of the early republic were predominantly of Reformation heritage. Their theological commitments, for better or for worse, conditioned the early character and trajectory of the nation. Any who deny this are simply not paying attention to the historical data. Secularist pluralism has no place in the historic American errand into the wilderness. And until we recognize this, we might toil in the wilderness forever. So I guess my question would be, do you believe that David French is toiling in the wilderness forever?
Yes, I do. And that has a double. I think Ben Dunson, the editor of American Reformer, was like, by the last two lines, what do you mean by this? Is it historically, like we're never going to figure it out, or is it normatively? I said both. Yeah. So it's both things. Until you're just not going to get, in my mind, in my opinion, you're not going to come to a proper understanding of your history and really yourself in that way, because you're part of this history until you recognize this. A secularist pluralist project was never in the cards for any of the people that did the real work and put in the blood, sweat, and tears for the first 100 years of the country. Or so, and I'm stretching that back to the Puritan founding. That's when the country begins. This is what Perry Miller says. This is why, by the way, we all know what the model of Christian charity is from Winthrop. This is Miller's impact. He, as you may know, was part of the kind of domestic counterintelligence unit in the American government during the Cold War. Counter propaganda. And so part of his historical stuff is always in some ways driven by what's the real, let's give ourselves a Christian and American narrative, even though he's not a Christian. And so the model of Christian charity becomes popular again. The presidents don't quote it until Kennedy and onward, because Miller kind of popularizes it. So it's that is recovered because you're wanting to get back to what you were, contradistinguished from what your enemy was at the time, but that doesn't make it any less. In fact, in some ways, we're facing the same enemy now, just on the domestic front. So Miller may be even more useful.
Right.
But that narrative of the kind of progressive narrative of this, secularist pluralism. This is what, they'll point to the absence of God in the national constitution. They'll point to, the couple people, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, that are deists,
right,
and these kinds of things, and make that everything. And
right.
It's like, well, there's lots more historical data there.
Yeah.
This does just not work. Does not compute. And unless you start paying attention to the broader picture, you're just going to swirl round and around in that, trying to make sense of your place as a Christian in your own country and how you should move forward, as long as you buy that narrative. Doesn't mean there weren't pluralist secularists at the time that were wanting something like that. But even Jefferson, that's a stretch to make. I mean, what he would make of certain things going on now is pretty easy to say. I mean, he would freak out about it, even if it's an arbitrary line. Same thing with Roger Williams, as I said, Corey was brought up earlier. So these guys that are fit in the secularist narrative in a certain way actually wouldn't have found themselves there.
No, and they keep trying to pull from history to try to justify the case, and it's like there's nothing there. Like, stop.
There's nothing there, and it doesn't. Even if they don't believe it, as a Christian, as a Christian nationalist, we might say,
sure, you
should at least get this down yourself. Otherwise, you're going to feel so unsettled, because we do need the myth. Again, doesn't mean the myth is untrue. I mean, we can do this with Genesis, right? Genesis is in the comparative literature very obviously meant to mirror and therefore counteract surrounding ancient Near East literature. In its style, it's an apologetic in many ways. It's mirroring their style to say this is something different. In that way, it's mythological. And if you read, even Genesis 1, the creation story, from just kind of a straightforward way, you're like, this is ridiculous. Because it's self-referential. Like, how do you talk about things being created out of nothing? This is weird. So you can say in many ways it's meant to be a myth. That doesn't mean it's untrue.
Right.
And that doesn't mean it's not factual. And we should think the same way about our national narrative. The myth is very important because it's formative, and progressives have realized this a long time ago.
Yes.
And they still do. And we've just not entered the fight, not entered the fray. So we should begin to do that as well. And I think the documented history supports us. It's just there's a lot of stuff that is there for the taking that we've not availed ourselves of.
That's what gets me going, is there's so much available. And if I were to make a final emphasis at the kind of close of the episode, it's people will look at me and my style and kind of my approach and engagement, and they go, what has gotten into him? And I'll never forget, in 2020, we were down in Texas, and Meemaw, Kim's grandmother, looked at me and she said, what is going on? She's crying. She's like, what is going on? She was born in the 30s. And they're retiring their family farm, 5 generations farming in the same town. And I contrast that with her kind of looking at me, and it felt like a charge almost of like, not only help, but what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
And that got in me. That's just I'm part of that family, and I want to do something other than just kind of like him in a hall, like, well, things are bad. Like, I want to do something. And then the other thing is, like, in that same context, we're now at a point where teachers in a local ISD in Texas are putting out dog bowls for kids that identify as dogs.
Right.
And think about the incongruency just intellectually between how she was raised and now, and how that should get in you and motivate you to do something about it. Like, you shouldn't just give over to some kind of pluralist fantasy about reality and about our nation. We should do something about it. Now, people are gifted in different ways and do different things. You're doing your own work out there and on the East Coast, and I'm trying to do my own work here in Colorado, but that would be my final exhortation. I think following Timon is a great way to kind of get a broader perspective. If they, obviously I'm going to link to this article we've referenced in the show notes. I want people to follow you on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle?
It's T. Lloyd Cline with 2 L's.
There you go.
TLLOYDCLINE. Yeah.
Perfect. And then is there anywhere else people should catch up with you?
No, I mean, I write at multiple places. American Reformer lately. I'd highly recommend. Not just mine, but lots of people's articles there. I mean, they're just putting out a lot of good stuff.
Yep.
I write at Modern Reformation regularly. I've written some other places. It doesn't matter, but highly recommend American Reformer just because of Brad Littlejohn writes there, Clifford Humphrey writes there, Miles Smith, lots of guys doing, if not directly in agreement with what I'm doing, very adjacent. Similar. Type of helpful work to the issues we're talking about, and so I would very much recommend them.
Cool, that's great
to everybody. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today, Timon.
Yeah, thank you, man.